Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. We're so pleased to have you all here. And we want to welcome Dr. William Green talking about his new book, Strike, which isn't quite out in bookstores yet, but it will be soon. And before I turn it over to Peter Ratcliffe at the Eastside Freedom Library, on behalf of everybody at the Ramsey County Historical Society, I want to thank you all again for being here. And for those of you who are members and donors to RCHS or to the Eastside Freedom Library, we very much appreciate that. If you have questions about becoming a member of the Ramsey County Historical Society or the Eastside Freedom Library, please check out our websites. They're on the slide on your screen. On April 8th, the first Thursday of next month, we will have the second in our series of Interrupted Childhood, Oral Histories of Polish World War II Survivors. And that's a very special program. And we hope that you'll consider joining us. It's an online program. So check out our websites for more details and Zoom registration. And as a reminder, please keep your microphones and personal cameras turned off during the program. You can put your questions and comments in the chat, and Peter and Clarence and I will monitor those, and we'll read those out for Dr. Green to answer. This program is being recorded, and it will be up on our Ramsey County Historical Society YouTube channels and the Eastside Freedom Library YouTube channels in a few days, probably the first part of next week or something like that. So RCHS has a statement that acknowledges this sacred Dakota land. Minnesota Makoche, the land where the waters are so clear they reflect the clouds, is the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota people. It is also home to the Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples. The Ramsey County Historical Society acknowledges that its sites are located on and benefit from these sacred Dakota lands. RCHS is committed to preserving our past, informing our present, and inspiring our future. Part of doing so is acknowledging the painful history and current challenges facing the Dakota people, just as we celebrate the contributions of Dakota and other indigenous peoples. And you can find our full land acknowledgement statement on our website, which includes actionable ways in which RCHS pledges to honor the Dakota and other indigenous peoples of Minnesota Makoche. RCHS and the Eastside Freedom Library, as well as our other partner, the Roseville Library, is committed to presenting the stories and histories of all in our community, and we're pleased to bring you tonight's program. So I'm going to turn it over to Peter at the Eastside Freedom Library to introduce Dr. Green. Thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you, Robin. I doubt that I could think of any other practicing historian who has had as much of an impact on how we understand Minnesota people's history than Bill Green. As I prepared to introduce him tonight, I was just stunned, though I've known him for 30 odd years, by his resume, by the work that he has done. And in his scholarly work, Bill has the knack, the ability to write in ways that make it accessible, even though the footnotes may amount to as many pages as the text does. The reading is just a pleasure. Bill's career is amazing, that he was on the Minneapolis School Board, that he served as superintendent of the Minneapolis Public Schools for 4 years, that he has both a JD, a law degree, and a PhD in history, and that he has now retired from the history department at Augsburg University. His books include Children of Lincoln, White Paternalism and the Limits of Black Opportunity in Minnesota, 1860 to 1875, Degrees of Freedom, The Origins of Civil Rights in Minnesota, 1865 to 1902, Nellie Francis, Fighting for Racial Justice and Women's Equality in Minnesota, and A Peculiar Imbalance, The Fall and Rise of Racial Equality in Minnesota. I think one of the great things about being a historian is if you're able to flex your muscle enough with your publisher that you can actually control the title that you put on the book, and which has not been my experience, but for Bill to subtitle that book, The Fall and Rise, where I think most of us would think, well, first you should say The Rise and Fall, is quite typical of how Bill's serious, in-depth scholarship is presented to us in a way that we can really take it in, engage with it, absorb it, and have it impact the ways that we think. So it's such a treat to have Bill with us. And he was talking before we started that he's just finished another manuscript, and hopefully that will soon be in our hands. And I do want to urge everyone to reach out to your favorite independent bookstore and get on the list for a copy of Strike when the book finally rolls off the presses. So I'm going to shut up and listen to my favorite Minnesota historian, Bill Green.
Peter, thank you so much. I'm flattered, a little sobered to the whole thing. I really appreciate those kind words, and hope I stand up to your praise. I want to thank, before I get started, the East Side Freedom Library and the sponsorship of by the Ramsey County Historical Society, as well as the Roseville Public Library, for this opportunity to present this evening. And my intention is to just read an excerpt from that book, leaving plenty of time, I hope, where for conversation, discussion, question and answer. And if the opportunity presents itself, I would like to share some of the reasons for me writing this piece, because I think that if many of you are like I was years back when I started this project, I didn't even know that there was a teacher strike, let alone have any context for the pain that I saw in the faces of the teachers who survived that era. What was it about that time that was so painful to them? Those are reasons why I wanted to write the book, and in doing so, the book became a vehicle for understanding Minneapolis at a turning point in its modern history, 1970, a time that hasn't yet really been fully examined, and one that I hope will be. So with that, I just want to begin by sharing a couple epigraphs that I found that I wanted to share with the reader, that I think they all serve as an illustration of the trajectory of labor relations between school districts, certainly in Minneapolis, and the teachers themselves. First one comes from the Minneapolis Tribune. No class renders more cheerful, loyal, and devoted service than the teachers of our public schools. None require a greater expenditure of mental and nervous energy. That's an interesting phrase, written at a time when unionism was viewed as the anathema of American civilization, and where teachers were treated as servile citizens. Nonetheless, we have this sentiment in the Minneapolis Tribune. The other thing I want to share with you is that teachers are afraid of the principal. The principal is afraid of the superintendent. The superintendent is afraid of the Board of Education. The Board of Education is afraid of the Board of Estimate and Taxation. The Board of Taxation is afraid of the parents. The parents are afraid of the students, and the students are not afraid of anyone. This was a quote from E. Dudley Parsons, who was a striker in 1970. So this was like 70 years after the first quote was presented. He was a teacher, district employee, picketer, and son of one of the founders of the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers. The third quote I want to share with you came from Jim Heller, who was a member of the executive board of the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers during the strike itself. And this was a quote that comes from a statement that he made during the reunion of participants in that 1970 strike. The reunion itself occurred in 1990, but it was a very powerful statement that I wanted to add and share with you. He said, quote, "Let me tell you that morning when we put that placard on our shoulder, when you put that placard on your shoulder and walked down the sidewalk, you had quit your job. You had given up seniority. You'd given up your salary. You'd given up your pension, probably if you weren't hired back." Now, this was 1990, describing what was at stake. And I want to return later on to that issue of what was at stake, because I think that you know, the risk that teachers, members of the union played and took cannot be overstated. It was a different time than the Minneapolis that we see today, know and love today, where the unions basically have more of a voice or more of an impact on public policy, or at least have a larger voice in terms of being heard. It was a different Minneapolis back then, and that's basically what I wanted to do, in addition to just tell the story of the strike itself, was to shed light on that other Minneapolis that's not too far away from today. So I'll begin. On the evening of April 8th, 1970, two men dressed in the dark suits that seemed more characteristic of mid-level company management hurried from the car that had taken a circuitous route to the Cross Keys Motel in Southwest Minneapolis, where they would anxiously spend the evening. Neither man expected to get much rest, let alone sleep, for what they had done just hours before was in violation of the law, and potentially even worse, alienating to a very large segment, an important segment of the citizenry who had entrusted the educational welfare of their children to their care. Would those mothers and fathers understand what the organization they led was doing and why the sacrifice was necessary? And would their own people, who hours before had jubilantly declared that they had had enough with the tyranny of an unjust law, defiantly stand up against it and the powerful men who resolutely stood behind it? How resolute would otherwise law-abiding citizens be the moment they, as the moral and educational stewards of 70,000 school children, felt the new label lawbreaker weigh down on their shoulders once the unsettling sobriety of the morning's light enveloped them? How strong would they remain during their sobering drive home to their families and the bills that would mount as their modest household savings dwindled? Would they all step forward in the morning at the designated time to the designated spot and show their faces to the citizens of Minneapolis? These were the key concerns that the two men had as they entered the motel room that they would soon share with a few others. They had worked hard to get the vote to strike, and so far the price for their labor was to be named in an injunction issued earlier that afternoon by Judge Leslie L. Anderson, and their anticipated arrest at any time. They expected the police to be waiting for them at their homes, which was why they hoped the cramped motel room would be the place for needed rest before the big moment in the morning. This was entirely new ground for these school teachers, and underneath the bravado, none of them knew how it would end, for they had reason to worry whether Minneapolis had grown weary of militancy. Indeed, the nation had grown cynical. It was the second year of Richard Nixon's presidency. For many, it was still hard to think how closely they had defeated Minnesota's happy warrior. He had defeated Minnesota's happy warrior as war continued to rage in Southeast Asia, despite the president's promise to bring the troops home. The nation had grown even more restive. Vice President Spiro Agnew, speaking for the so-called silent majority, called such critics effete snobs and nattering nabobs of negativity. On February 20th, U.S. District Judge Julius Hoffman sentenced 5 of the Chicago 8, at which time defendant David Dellinger told the judge that he was a man who had too much power over too many people for too many years, but added mockingly that he admired Hoffman's spunk. On a more tragic level, out east, a grand jury on Martha's Vineyard assembled on April 6th to investigate Ted Kennedy's involvement in the death of Mary Jo Kopechne. A month later, on May 4th, 4 Kent State University students would be shot and killed by the Ohio National Guard, and the hard hats and anti-war demonstrators would fight each other on the streets of New York City on May 8th. Near the end of the year, on November 17th, the courts-martial of 17 officers would begin for their role in the My Lai massacre. And during the months in between, teachers would strike in Los Angeles, Oakland, and Chicago. Minnesota was not insulated from unrest that brought a conservative tint to the body politic. College students occupied administration buildings at McAllister and St. Olaf, and university students occupied the Red Barn in Stadium Village. Charles Stenvig, a former police officer and now the city's mayor, was at war with the Civil Rights Commission, sparked by the 1967 race riot on Minneapolis's north side, and many civilians, no doubt reminded of horrific images of Black children being set upon in Bull Connor's Birmingham in 1963, and more recently of anti-war demonstrators in Mayor Daley's Chicago, warily looked on as the Minneapolis Police Department, as if to follow suit, acquired police dogs. Everyone seemed to be striking: truck drivers, carpenters, cement masons, Honeywell tradesmen, then postal workers and air traffic controllers, as well as mothers on welfare. They went on strike. It was this sign of the times that prompted lawmakers to nip in the bud the perceived rising tide of anarchy when they enacted Meet and Confer for public employees. That's the name of a law that basically gutted any serious public collective bargaining. Indeed, Minneapolis teachers were part of a movement toward greater militancy in education in general, and toward a stronger voice in determining the quality of their work environment. They had previously taken to the streets. In 1948, they had experienced several pay cuts and were out in the bitter cold weeks of that year. Again, in 1951, teachers had gone out in support of the janitors' strike. That same year, in response to these strikes, a no-strike law for public employees was passed, barring, in a procedurally questionable violation of the constitutional ex post facto ban, any increase of benefits to those who took to the streets. Further, under the new law, strikers were subject to a possible automatic dismissal, or at least a loss of tenure with a 2-year probation and a forfeiture of any salary increase if they were rehired. One was deemed guilty simply for committing the act, and there were no provisions for appeal or allowances for mitigating circumstances. In 1967, the legislature under the authorship of an attorney and Republican lawmaker named Clinton Hall from Rushford in southeast Minnesota, who chaired the Labor Relations Committee in the House, passed the infamous meet and confer law, which made no provision for real collective bargaining. It was not mutually binding, and it made no provision for mediation and arbitration. As if this were not enough, the 1967 law retained provisions banning strikes by teachers and imposed severe sanctions against those who nonetheless went on strike. As the state Supreme Court affirmed, quote, strikes by public employees are a real danger to the safety and welfare of the general public, close quote. In these troubling times, at least my child's school teacher would not be disrupting my family's life, many Minneapolis parents apparently probably hoped. It was an attitude many teachers felt as well. The educational welfare of 70,000 children would be affected. It was one thing to cheer amid an enthusiastic throng of friends and colleagues in response to inspiring MFT leaders calling for a strike, quite another to actually doing it. Norm Moen, then MFT president, and Dale Hostrom, executive secretary, who would lead negotiations for MFT, knew it as well. Neither slept that night. Adrenaline was their only fuel that morning as they nervously drove north on Nicollet. As they came to the rise of Nicollet Avenue, which momentarily blocked their view of the intersection where strikers were to meet, their nerves tightened. What greeted them as they crossed over was the gathering of hundreds of teachers who filled the intersection, waiting for their leaders to arrive. As Hallstrom would later say, I was exhilarated. People I never thought would be on the line were there. At least half a dozen I never would have bet a dime on, close quote. It had finally begun, and they were, all of them, fully committed and suddenly without benefits, without retirement, without a job. So I'll stop there.
So Steve Brandt put a question in the chat, Bill, that he understood that veterans were an important cohort within the teachers union.
Yeah.
Did you find that? Was that a topic that came up? And if so, you know, what kind of both experience did having served in the military provide, and what kind of impact did they have?
Well, especially with the National Guard, officers and soldiers who were in service would be denied benefits if they represented or participated in the strike itself and could not participate in normal activities. And the commandant, actually, or the commander of the National Guard from Minnesota, found a way to step around it because he did not want to penalize his people, some of whom were themselves teachers as well. So they kind of worked with the school district and with the union in stepping around any kind of penalty that the officers, that the soldiers would incur. It was interesting. That's a perfect example, really, of the kinds of allies that the teacher organizers found in various places and support. They clearly received support from teachers from surrounding school districts who themselves could not go out on strike because they taught in much more conservative school districts. They nonetheless showed their support by providing money and attending rallies and by lobbying and things of that nature. But you also had one ally who I doubt he would consider himself to have been an ally, but it was Charles Stenvick of all people. Remember, Stenvick was a union guy. He was president of the Federation of the Police Organization before becoming mayor, and he had experienced in negotiations in behalf of his membership similar kinds of limitations. He was very concerned about how close the teachers would come to actually compelling him to take the side of state law. He warned the teachers union that you have to be very careful about how you move around this thing, but at the same time, at no time was threatening to them. He expressed in quiet meetings, in private meetings with leaders, his general support, and he shared with them the experiences he had during the rough negotiations with City Hall over police contracts. So it was a strange kind of odd bedfellow type situation that existed there. There were even Republican legislators who came from safe Republican districts who basically recognized that the law itself was unjust. And one legislator in particular, his name is Ashbach, was the author of a bill that would ultimately provide the law that would become PELRA, Public Employee Labor Relations Act legislation. So even though the Republican Party was officially hostile to the union itself, and any organization that normally would be viewed as supportive and sympathetic to the Republican perspective, even in those situations, many of those organizations tended to find ways or attempt to find ways to avoid any kind of conflict or any way that would directly undercut the union and the strike itself. Even school board members were torn by the role that they were mandated to perform, protecting the welfare of the district, which in this context was at the expense of the welfare of the teachers. Many of them showed and expressed considerable respect for the teacher group that they had hired and had supported. But they also were mandated by the law. So they worked day and night, it seemed, to try to find a way to kind of thread the needle, so to speak. Not always successfully, but the lines weren't as clearly drawn as one would think during this particular time. And the reference to the military and the National Guard is a perfect example of that.
There are wonderful questions showing up in the chat. What about, there's a question about the demographics of the teachers.
Yeah.
Gender, race, and I would add also, where did the leaders in the union come from? I think in lots of places people have found that high school teachers, and predominantly male high school teachers,
Right.
were often the leading force in the union.
Yeah.
So who are the teachers from a demographic point of view, Bill?
Let me put this in context. MFT, the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers, which was the union that led the strike, was basically founded by women. And the leaders of MFT for a long time were the women teachers in the group. As you know, the men who belonged to MFT also had to deal with their own issues with being in an organization where the leaders were women, and they even talked about splitting away from MFT to create an all-male union, but that union never really survived. Ultimately, the male organization, the men's organization, and the women's organization came back. The strategy and the tactics really of the women leaders of MFT, I thought was quite effective in being patient and showing restraint, to not screaming or expressing what obviously was considerable frustration behind closed doors towards their male counterparts. But the men found that they could not really survive as a separate organization. They had to return to the fold, so to speak. So it's interesting to note that MFT initially was an organization that was created and led by women. There were men leaders during this time, but the majority were women. Over time, that would change, where the men would become more prominent. Now, the MFT group became more male dominated. I'm not sure exactly what year you would begin to see that, but I know that by the mid to late 60s, and definitely heading into 70, you would find more men ascending. MFT was also viewed as the coaches union. Okay, so that's another example of how the MFT was viewed as a male-dominated organization. Their rival was the City of Minneapolis Education Association, which was much more conservative and much older, and it tended to be more patriarchal. And what the members of that organization used to say, they used to look down upon MFT because MFT had the reputation of being boorish and kind of filled with testosterone and indelicate and therefore inappropriate to be teaching children. So this was one way that the organizations kind of took on different identities for all intents and purposes. Now, during the negotiations, coming back to 1970, during the negotiations, it was male dominated. The negotiating team for MFT was male dominated. There was one woman who served on that negotiation team. She was an elementary school teacher, and she was a force of nature. At one time, it looked as if MFT was about to settle on an agreement early on in the strike with the school district. This particular teacher, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember her name, and I apologize for not remembering. She basically had a class, so she wasn't able to be present during the negotiations. She arrived late, just as the president of the union was about to call the superintendent to say that we agreed to the terms. And when they read her the terms that the other group was about to agree to, she says, "I'm not going to support that. I want more benefits for school prep. I want teachers to have more time to prepare between classes. I want teachers to be more empowered for discipline, to deal with discipline. I want more support and prep for elementary school teachers, because they had been pretty much shoved to the side." And the men on the negotiating team basically acceded to what she said. They reopened negotiations. They called the superintendent, says we're not all in agreement, and they went back into negotiations. I might add one other thing. One of the meeting places for negotiations occurred in the one of the conference rooms in the Minneapolis Athletic Club, which was an all-male bastion at that time. And here they were they meaning the teachers union, MFT, and the school district were going to sit down and negotiate another round they've already violated the law by having negotiations, and that's a separate issue altogether. The point here is that because Colleen Shepman, that's her name, because Colleen was a woman, even though she was a representative of the bargaining unit for the teachers, she was barred from entering the club. So she had to sit outside. And when her male colleagues learned of this, they said, we're not meeting here anymore, because they had forgotten the bar against women, or had, decided that because we're dealing with contract negotiations, it would be set to the side. Whatever the case may be, even though Colleen was the only woman leader, in negotiations, she was the one who really kept the men focused on the larger issues that would reflect the needs of women teachers. For example, maternity leave, that was a big issue. She had said when she became a representative on the negotiating team that maternity leave was going to be a major thing that she will push for. Well, that had not been dealt with until she came back and reminded the men that this is supposed to be on the table. So that's a roundabout way of getting to the question that you raised, Peter. It was male dominant in terms of the leadership and the identity of the teachers union of MFT was male oriented. But women were not yet had not returned to the leadership role in time for the 1970 strike. But there were a number of women who would become the leaders within the coming years. One person in particular, Louise Sundin, who would become president of the teachers union, was at that time a junior teacher at Ramsey. But she basically, was learning the ropes about how to negotiate and how to do politics, labor politics, and how to articulate and strategize and all that. She was learning it from the people who seemed to be very successful, namely men. But they recognized her strengths and they basically began to support her. So a new generation is coming in terms of leadership.
Mm-hmm. There's a question, how did the rest of the labor movement, both in Minneapolis and over in St. Paul, how did the rest of the labor movement respond to this strike?
The various bargaining units and the labor organizations were supportive of the strike. On the other hand, and they supported them in what they consider to be the safest way, because they did not want to go on strike. They did not want to place themselves in the eye of the storm, so to speak. It seemed to me, that's my reading of it. They were very careful about how they would come out, but they did support the union publicly, and they did support the strike, and they showed their support in terms of providing legal support for striking teachers who would need legal protection. They donated funds to the strike fund, provided facilities for union negotiations or meetings and whatnot. So they supported the union as well as they could, but they stopped short of actually joining the picket line. And as a matter of fact, some of the organizations discouraged their members from striking. And what that does basically is weaken the teachers group, because they were really the only organization that was, putting everything on the line by going to the streets. I was kind of disappointed that they would play that role, but then, you sort of think about the times. And, considering the history that I shared with you, it was not a foregone conclusion that the teachers would win. And it wasn't just because of the teachers' commitment to the struggle. They didn't have a lot of resources to begin with. Most of them had never been in this kind of action before. Many of them could see their income decrease. recognized a very real likelihood that they could lose their homes. And at this particular time, early on in the strike, there are a lot of Minneapolis residents who were at best ambivalent about seeing teachers strike. I don't know how many of you were here in the 50s and the 60s. I certainly remember there was a show called Our Mrs. Brooks, Our Miss Brooks. And that show sort of characterized the ideal teacher who was, inoffensive, non-threatening, charming, a good citizen, so to speak. And so teachers at that time were struggling to change their identity in real time. Remember, this is also in a couple months, you're going to have another show that really sort of shows the new woman in a light that suggests that there isn't a lot of newness there. And that's the Mary Tyler Moore show that would characterize what Minneapolis was all about. Now, that show doesn't get started until November of 1970, months after the strike ended. But it shows the nature of what women's lib meant, what women's lib meant. There was something, you're kind of pushing against the wall, but not too far, and not too hard. Rules were changing, identity was changing. I'm sorry, I kind of missed your point. I forgot your question, and I apologize.
No, it's all relevant and great information. So our friend Jamie Fitzpatrick put in the chat that he's reading an original letter to the Minneapolis teachers from the Lindquist and Venom law firm, dated April 22nd. And it states, quote, "No wish to be vindictive in applying the law against any teacher," but then it proceeds to quote the law and continues for 2 pages, outlining the loss of employment and benefits clearly intended to threaten teachers to break the strike. Can you characterize what the tactics were used? And someone else asked if you would give the name of who was the superintendent at that time. But and then what are the tactics that are being used, particularly to intimidate the teachers?
Yeah, I think I read that letter too. That letter was characteristic of the inclination for status quo. Even those who were aware, like for example, the president of the school board, Stu Ryder, was very much aware of the problems that teachers faced in doing their job, and he had sincere support for the teachers. He basically also, as a sworn school board chair, duty bound to uphold the law, which was you don't negotiate with strikers. That's against the law. And in negotiating with these people, we are in violation of the law and therefore subject to penalties from the state, namely the school district. So you had both lawyers and corporate executives and whatnot preferring for this thing to go away, very frustrated that a resolution hadn't been reached, and also, as in the way of men in power, when they don't get their way, they kind of remind people of their place. And this is kind of what that letter was about as well. So it was a very, I'm very sympathetic. I appreciate the brochure for this presentation that refers to me being a superintendent, because I understand the tensions, the binds that school district leaders faced because many of them had long-term relationships with teachers. and respected teachers, and were willing to consider ways of making sure that teachers, despite the law, would be able to have a job to come back to, and were willing to explore ways in which they could retain their tenure and pension and all of that. All of that stuff, their heart told them to really consider. On the other hand, they exhibited in the quieter moments, and sometimes, they were quite vocal, their frustration that there didn't seem to be any bridges being formed between themselves, who they viewed themselves to be very good people, namely the leaders of the school district interest, and the teachers themselves, that they felt the teachers were putting them in a corner. I think that letter that you refer to characterizes, at least, the sentiment of a number of people who were sympathetic philosophically, but also very much committed to orderly debate. If you don't like the law, change the law. You don't go to the streets. And if you insist on going to the streets, then you deserve whatever punishment comes down the line. It was an interesting time where people were forced to be 2 and 3 different kinds of people at the same time. They took a position, and at the same time found themselves being sympathetic to the other side. I've got a story I want to share with you that sort of characterizes this. I interviewed a teacher who was a member of the CMEA, the conservative union that did not go out on strike. And he was a teacher in a school that was dominated by MFT teachers and the jocks. He had walked down the hall. He was just starting his career. He was walking down the hall when one of the MFT leaders came up to him, threw his arm around this particular teacher's throat, and said, "Real men join the union." This is what the guy said. He released this particular teacher, but this teacher, who had not yet joined a union or joined any organization, had decided, because of that manhandling, that he was going to join CMEA, the more conservative union, not because he understood what they represented or even supported what they represented, but because of this attitude of this particular guy. The CMEA knew that they had to do something, though. They needed to educate the city as to what the strike was about and what it was not about. And so they decided to have something called the Truth Squads, form the Truth Squads, who would be members of CMEA, go downtown and hand out leaflets, basically separating themselves from MFT. This particular teacher, who had just joined the association, had walked, had stood on the street long enough to pass out brochures, and then he had to report to school. If he didn't report to school, he would lose his job. He would be viewed as a striker. So he had to go to a school. The thing is that his school was on the corner of of Nicollet and 50th. That was Ramsey. And Ramsey was one of the hotbeds for the union. He was not a member of the union. The streets were clogged with strikers and with cars and with people, curiosity seekers and whatnot. It was so crowded on that corner that day that this particular teacher could not cross over. And he said he was a little intimidated at the prospect of having to go through all of this stuff in order to get into the building. So he ended up staying outside on the street, thinking that he would go to school the next day. But in staying out on the street, he had unintentionally become a striker. He didn't support the strike necessarily, and he didn't support the union necessarily, but because of circumstance, he found himself having no control over where he stood, over the role that he played. And so for many of the teachers during this time, and as his strike progressed, for many people observing the thing, whether they were parents, elected officials, organizers, whatever, anybody affected by the strike was eventually going to be drawn into the gray area. That's another fascinating thing about this episode, Minneapolis history. When we look, and Peter, when historians look at time, they have to kind of, if they're going to be doing their research and their scholarships justice, they got to be mindful of the gray area. They have to try to make sense of the gray area. They have to try to understand the attitudes of people who got mired in the gray area. That's what the real history is about. And that's kind of what the strike was about. It was a situation that compelled people to be torn between competing passions. And once again, coming back to the letter, I think that letter characterizes my reading of it, at least, and my understanding of the person who wrote it. I think characterized the frustration he felt being torn by competing forces that he had no control over.
Let me stay with that for a minute, Bill. And most of your work, research and writing, has been 19th century and early 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
One of the, I think, threads that runs through your work is challenging us to think differently about the word liberalism. And for the most part, most of your work has used racism and the dynamics of racial inequity as a way to interrogate liberalism.
Yeah.
But listening to you talk about the Lindquist and Venom letter and the management resistance to these, so not the internal union stuff, but the school board stance and the superintendent's stance and the mayor's stance, and how do you see the strike as giving us a window into thinking more critically about what has called itself liberalism in Minnesota?
Oh, that's a hell of a question, Peter. Well, I think it begins with the notion of with the power of the concept of good intentions. I think it begins with that, because I think that those who we consider and who consider themselves to be liberals are convinced that they mean well, that they know what evil is, and that they are not that. I think that many people traditionally who consider themselves liberal find, if they really look at the world in which they inhabit, they see a world that is more gray than black and white, and it unnerves them. And so there's an inclination to create a distinct line between those two things, which is one reason why I think many of us get frustrated with our friends who consider themselves liberal, who attend, all white churches and, tend to tolerate the kinds of stuff that's happening with poor people in America, whether it's, whether you're talking about race or whether you're talking about poor white people. It's a very awkward thing to be educated about our history because we have faces and names and actions that crystallize what villainy and poor behavior is. But we live in a world in which that is not as prevalent, at least in the same way that it was historically. And that kind of gives us cover to not address basic issues. I mean, as one who worked on the school district, one of the most challenging issues that the board had to face was the changing of attendance boundaries. We had a situation where we drew lines that would require students living in a certain area. I'm not going to name the neighborhood because it would be unfair to them. And they're good people. But they were used to being able to send their kids to a certain school. And this new line basically would have them go to a school where the attendance was predominantly of color. And the parents basically demonstrated against the board and even threatening to draw the line there. And they even had their kids talk about how they weren't going to go to an integrated school, because that's what we're talking about here. The school that they wanted to go to was predominantly white and middle class. They didn't want to go to an integrated school. And they threatened to leave the district. And in doing that, they were basically going to an immersion school in the suburbs whose program was diversity. But most of the students there were from the outer rims of the metro area, which meant that they were predominantly white middle class. So you have all of these twisting lines, going on. That's kind of the reality of our world now. I used to get all kinds of phone calls from reporters during the George Floyd incident, and many of these reporters were from European countries, from other places outside the country. But they knew about Minneapolis's liberalism, and they were perplexed by what they heard about, Chauvin and the police department and all that. This was all new to them. They couldn't understand how this could happen. And so much of my time was spent in explaining, that we have been very successful in creating an image for ourselves that we then kind of hand over to the next generation as if it's true. The work that you refer to talks about how that happened, and it happens in part by who has control of those who define our images and project our images. What kinds of images do we show? Mary Tyler Moore has come back to haunt us in a sense, because the only Black guy in that episode that series was the weatherman. And we don't get any sense that they had a relationship or friendship or collegial contact outside the newsroom. Well, that was liberalism.
Someone asks the very good question: how was the story of this strike erased, forgotten, tucked away? And I think all of us who are with you tonight, Bill, watched the more recent Minneapolis teacher strike, and that provided a moment for the 1970 strike to be brought back into discourse. But how did it get dropped out of the self-understanding of Minneapolis?
That is a wonderful question. You kindly refer to the respect I have from my publisher and accepting my title and all of that, but I don't always have control over the images on the cover. And it's almost always a source of consternation, heartburn and whatnot. But on the cover of this particular book, not only do I have a striker, oh, you've seen it, I mean, you know, but there's a newsman, there's a cameraman who's there. He plays as much of a role in how the strike is presented and how it is viewed. How is it that record disappeared after the strike? Well, I think a couple things were at play here. Number one, I'm not sure. I don't have confidence that a lot of people at the time knew how historical this strike was. Secondly, and I think even more so the point, is that so many teachers were emotionally bruised by what happened. I mean, it was painful. It was the reason why I wanted to look into the strike in the first place. It was as if the teachers who went through that strike had gone to war. And they talked about or non-talked about that strike in similar terms. They didn't want to tell those stories because it was too painful. It stunned me that the strike would have that kind of impact on teachers. I mean, I've been through strikes. I know what can happen. I know what has happened. And none of that occurred on the picket line between teachers and whatnot. There was no violence at all. But the emotional stress and strain among the teachers themselves was such that they didn't talk a lot about it. At the beginning of the book, in the prologue, I refer to one of the teachers trying to organize a reunion of survivors of the strike, and that she had a very difficult time getting even a response or having anybody from the opposing union want to participate. They had all come back together. Many of the relationships did not get repaired. But the point that I'm making is that it was painful even among friends in opposing sides. I referred to Colleen Shipman, for example, who was very, she talked about the collegial relationship in her building. She was the only MFT member for all intents and purposes. And as she got more involved in the union, the relationship that ruptured between herself and her colleagues never healed after the strike itself. And what that meant was that people just wanted to move on. They wanted to get on with their lives. They wanted to get past the ugly and the painful. And that's a human reaction.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one reason why I just dropped out. Another generation, we're not good with institutional memory as a as a culture.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm seeing that history is about ready to be dropped from many curriculum of the colleges. The New Yorker did a piece on this very point, and I'm seeing that with other colleges. They're getting rid of history as a serious department. What that means is that just exacerbates, the end of institutional memory in a sense, unless people are taking, classes, and I see that happening. But the young people are not really the managers. They're not really the messengers. They're not really the purveyors of that history, and that's where we've got a loose link.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one reason. Those are a couple of reasons why we didn't know anything about it.
Thank you. I'm realizing that around the same time is the struggle over the integration of the Minneapolis schools. So when I moved to Minnesota to start teaching at Macalester College, the president of Macalester was John Davis.
Right.
And John had been superintendent in a
During
very
yeah.
Was he the superintendent during the strike?
He was the superintendent during the strike. He had just moved to Minneapolis from Massachusetts a year or two before the strike began.
Yeah. And so I wonder, and when my colleagues at Macalester would talk about the president, this guy, John Davis, they would talk about what a heroic role he had played in the integration of the Minneapolis schools. Were the issues of integration and teacher unionism completely separate from each other? Did they interweave in important ways?
You've just made my life difficult, because that's going to be the next thing I work on, the next book. I see that as a sequel to the strike. Mm-hmm. I see that as another chapter of 1970, 1971. Mm-hmm. To answer your question, there weren't a lot of Black teachers in the profession. Mm-hmm. but those who were active in the strike themselves. But there was a separation between racial issues. Just a year or so before, you had, Plymouth and the Avenue riot. And actually, it was 1967, but not long before you had that issue. So it was hard to separate. Number one. Number two, residential segregation in the city was something that was kind of invisible until the teachers' strike began. You see teachers, for example, at Franklin High School, elementary, either middle school or elementary, on the north side, really debating whether to change the name of the school to, I don't remember if it was Marcus Garvey or, but to an African American leader, and they were negotiating with the school board to give them the right to change it, not because the teachers were of color, the majority of the teachers there were white, but because the students were of color. The strike itself basically seemed to run parallel. The forces leading to the strike seemed to run parallel to the deseg piece, but by the end of the 1970, I think 70. I don't remember the month, but fall 1970, I'm just throwing that out there. It was becoming increasingly more and more difficult on the part of the school district to separate school deseg from the union issue. And it played out this way. Most of the legislators representing, certainly those who had the most influence in the legislature, represented South Minneapolis, and they were concerned about kids being bused from one school to the other. That's when the pairing program began, and it ran about the same. It got started about the time that the strike itself was moving away from Minneapolis and heading to negotiations in St. Paul. Legislators were choosing sides because they were looking at the teachers' union in the same way as they were looking at the school board's determination to go into school desegregation. And they saw that as an illustration of Minneapolis losing control of the school district itself. Losing control in the sense that, we seem to be heading at a time where kids from the north side could be coming to school down here. And as down here right now is predominantly white, and we want to keep it as it is. This was also a time where people are beginning to leave the city. They're leaving the city in white flight, and this is something that Richard Nixon not only expressed, but also facilitated. He encouraged white flight to the suburbs. And we know about banking practices and whatnot that basically made it difficult for white homeowners, for Black and Latino homeowners to be able to get loans to be able to purchase homes in the suburbs. So Minneapolis schools were beginning to look increasingly more like people of color, at least in the schools themselves. And the teachers were kind of caught in between. I'm not aware of any kind of resistance on the part of teachers to dealing with deseg. They tended to look at a kid as a kid to be taught. I think that teachers who did look at race only were those teachers who also fled the city for the suburbs. But I don't really get a sense of that being as widespread. So somehow, and that's something I would like to explore more, the distinction between the deseg chapter and the school strike, or the teacher strike chapter. There seems to be something there between those two events that come close to coinciding, but not exactly overlapping.
It's only
a year or two, and I'll be able to have some answers for you. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Peter.
it's only 2 years after the New York City teachers strike and the Ocean Hill-Brownsville conflict and the African American community seeking community control and the United Federation of Teachers opposing community control of the schools. And so, I mean, people had to be aware of that, talking about that, thinking about that. Yeah, it's, and I think given the form today is charter schools as a way of as a way of resegregating the public schools.
Right. And to some extent, magnet schools, even though magnets were intended to desegregate.
So there's also questions in the chat about you and the fact that you did a stretch as superintendent of the Minneapolis schools. Did that give you added insight when you came to write this book?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I had a chance to see, another side of the issue. I had a chance to be reminded of just how complex, issues confronting modern America and Minneapolis in particular are. And it's made it more difficult for me to say, although I may have sounded like I was categorical about any number of issues tonight, it's made it more difficult for me to assume that my assumptions are legitimate. It's made me think about, looking at people who I would otherwise assume to be just blatantly wrong or whatever. I just kind of hold back on that, those judgments. So it's made my life more complex. But at the same time, I feel like it's provided richness to the kind of research I want to do, if I can execute it well.
So there was just recently this strike of Minneapolis teachers. How do you see the strike of 1970 and the strike of 2022 as being in conversation with each other, being connected to each other? Do you see connections?
I see it in the sense of it being a continuum. The Minneapolis public schools of 1970 and the school district of 2020, what was it, 2020, is different in a sense because our understanding of special education, for example, has grown more sophisticated, I think. I think our understanding of diversity and what children of different cultural backgrounds have, and the duty that the school district faces with an increasingly diverse student population, I think that's a modern issue for all intents and purposes. I think that we have not, and this is probably the biggest problem. We've not really been able to align the needs of public education with the needs of the public educators. The issues that, and I didn't really follow the strike, the more recent teacher strike very closely, but it seemed to me from what I did read that some of the issues that they dealt with were issues that were historic, that were never really resolved. The first epigraph that I read basically illustrates how easy it is for us to soft soap, the quality of education that we provide kids or our commitment to teachers. No class renders more cheerful, loyal, devoted service than the teachers of our public schools. I think everybody loved the teachers. I don't know, maybe the teachers union didn't feel that way recently. But there is this thing that hasn't changed. We take pride in being a city that really values public education, and we look at the achievement gap. That's yet another example of, liberalism, I guess.
Right.
The disjunct between good intentions and reality, what's actually done. And I don't know how far that disjunct is today, as opposed to how it was in 1970. I read a letter, a speech actually by Hubert Humphrey when he was mayor of the city. He still had his membership card to the teachers union when he was mayor of the city, and he argued in behalf of improving the quality of life for teachers. He said, if we want people to really do a service to our children, we've got to give them with the support they need to be able to do that. And that means we've got to make sure that they have a reasonable life, that they can model mobility and upward movement and whatnot. Well, look at where we are now. I don't know how much money teachers make now, but I do know some of the challenges that some of the teachers are facing in their classrooms, and many of them are demoralized.
Mm-hmm.
So we haven't really made the kind of advancement that I think we like to believe,
Mm-hmm.
without any kind of close look at what's going on.
Thank you. So we've got, maybe 15 minutes left, and I'm kind of taking up all of Bill's time, and I would like to invite Robin. Do you want to make it possible for people to show us their faces, and they can unmute their audios, and we can move to a little bit more of informal conversation here in the last part?
Yeah, let's do
And I don't know if Bill, if you noticed that Colleen Shepman joined us. She's
Oh,
here.
did she?
And so at the very least, I would like her to show herself and have us express our appreciation to her. And so, Robin, you want to make those changes?
Yeah, however, I would ask that if you aren't speaking or you have background noise, that please keep your microphones turned off so that we don't get a lot of feedback, and so everybody can hear everybody speaking. And let's get that. And remember, we are all still recording. If you feel like you don't want to say anything too personal, that's totally okay. So you should be able to unmute, but again, let's just watch background noise. Perfect. Okay.
So there's Colleen. Hello, Colleen.
Hi.
Hi, Colleen. How are
Hi.
you doing?
Well, I'm doing very well. I am now a resident of North Carolina. Can you believe it?
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
But my son is here with me. And anyway, excuse me. The main reason that we went on strike, in my opinion, is that I was representing the elementary teachers at the time, and we would go in for collective bargaining. We would go in to negotiate, and we had no power at all. It was like, one of the school board members actually said, when I said we had no prep time, he said, why don't you put on a movie? Well, what movie? How long would it take to prepare the movie for the kids? And why would the kids sit still and be educated from any old movie? So those kinds of things were issues for us. And we wanted to be able to have a prep time like they had in 7th grade. They taught by the subjects, but then they had a 50-minute prep. We taught all the subjects and we had no prep. So that was one of the major reasons that we were trying to negotiate to get that, and we're getting nowhere. As a result of the strike, they had to hire art, gym, and music teachers in order to provide prep time. And that was a big help to elementary teachers, because otherwise we were just hauling everything home and working at home after school. So that was one of the main issues. The other thing that was important to me was that we weren't listened to. We would bring our troubles or our requests to the board, and they didn't listen to us. They didn't pay any attention. And so we had to do something to change that. And that was the strike, which was successful in that way. So
Yeah, the school district and the superintendent's team did not believe that the strike was going to have. One of the school board members actually said they've all been crying wolf, so we don't need to take them seriously. That was what one of the board members said about it, and they were just, as you said, very surprised that the teachers would actually get the votes to be able to take it to the streets.
yeah, well, I was never out on the streets because I was negotiating. And so I felt badly that they had to be out on the streets. But on the other hand, we won. We won prep time and we got collective bargaining. And that was an important thing for that state, for all of the teachers, even the nurses got collective bargaining. So for me, that was one of the main wins of the strike.
Well, you can't forget, you guys really provided groundwork for PELRA.
Right.
All public employees really benefited as a result of the work of the teachers.
That's right.
Yeah.
So it was an ordeal to go through. And after it was over, I climbed Mount Thielsen. My name is on the top of the mountain.
Really?
Just to clear my
Can I
head.
ask a question of you?
What?
Why do you think people did not know much about the strike after the strike, you know, by the mid 70s and whatnot? Why do you think? I'm sorry?
I don't know. I just hoped that collective bargaining was strong in that state, and not just in Minneapolis, but that would help the nurses as well as the teachers. And I believe that collective bargaining is the main win. So,
Well, Colleen, it's a joy that you're with us, and the wonders of Zoom. Here you are in North Carolina. So
yes,
it's just wonderful.
And I'm a techno peasant, actually, as my grandchildren call me. But my son is sitting here, and he's a tech guy. So, which is why he's living in North Carolina.
Well, while we have a little bit of time left, are there others of you who want to say anything?
Well, I still love Minneapolis, and even though I'm not there, I wish them the best. And even the winters where I am down here today at 81 degree temperatures.
Wow.
And I miss a lot of it, but on the other hand, I'm grateful to be here with my family, with my son. And
thank you for doing this research and writing this book. It's been a great thing for me.
Yes.
I had a wonderful conversation with Colleen, and She talked about her early days, what got her in trouble in the first place by getting involved with unions. Back in mine at North Dakota, was it,
Yes,
where you got started? And she was
yes.
the only
Well, I
the
could
only
see,
union
in my
person.
opinion, that the EA was not doing anything for us. And so we had to go with the union. And then I worked also with the Central Labor Union Council. I went to meetings and so on with them. So their support was very important and very helpful. And so I didn't feel like we were out there alone with the Central Labor Union Council on our side. So, and anyway, it was, I think, productive. And it made me feel like things aren't impossible, you know, could change things. I'm a Democrat, so.
Well, on that point, proof positive that things can change is as a result of the organization of the teachers and and what they learned about empowering themselves as a unit. You had some very powerful DFL candidates running for governor who would eventually, and for the Senate, who would eventually sort of spearhead in a legislative way new legislation and law that would secure bargaining rights for teachers. I'm talking about Wendy
That's right.
Anderson.
And I was very grateful to, and we had one of our union members on the board. I'm not going to remember the name right now, but he was very helpful. And then he ran for legislature and won.
That's right.
So
That's right.
I can see him, but I can't say his name. Anyway, I thought that Minnesota being where the AFL originated in 1932, that we carried out our side later on.
Yeah.
Anyway,
And thank you, Colleen. Thank you. And anyone, we have just a couple minutes left. Anyone else want to make it? Yes, Joanne, please.
Yeah, I would just like to say thank you. This has been most informative to me. I was more involved in civil rights in the 70s and I'm from St. Paul and lived in Shoreview at that time. So Minneapolis was way over there. But, this has been informative. I'm puzzled about what went on in St. Paul in 1947. I thought there was a teacher strike then.
There was one.
Yeah, okay. I was in high school and I got to go to work because we didn't have to go to school. So I remember this as an advantage to me, but I don't remember the details of what went on, except I thought it was a strike. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. St. Paul did have a strike back then. I don't remember what all the issues were, but they did have a strike back then.
I believe one of the issues was that the teachers were buying toilet paper and bringing toilet paper for the restrooms. It was coming out of their pockets. And that became symbolic of what little resources the school district was actually providing for teachers to educate kids with.
In a similar vein, John B. Davis talks about how during the first year of superintendency, he was visiting schools, and in one of the schools, teachers asked him, "Could you kindly bring some chalk? We have no chalk here."
Oh, yeah.
And so he was asked to bring chalk from the school in order to provide him with supplies. It was shocking because he came from a lace curtain type of school district. You know, he came from a well-to-do school district back in Massachusetts. He said that any one of the smaller schools that he taught at and was an administrator had better resources than Minneapolis had.
Yeah. And that stays a constant problem, it seems.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Marcia Afner, you put in the chat that there's a movie made by the Labor Ed Service. Can you unmute and just tell us a little more about that?
I don't know very much about it, but Bill Moore is here as well and told me that was it John C. who worked on it?
It's a video just recently finished. Louise Sundin would be able to give you the details on it, and John C. from the Labor Education Service worked on it. I haven't seen it yet, but it's good. It's everybody's I've talked to said they've seen it and said it's very good.
Well, I'll reach out to John and see if we can get our hands on it, our electronic hands.
I thought Louise was on the list of people who were here for a while, but maybe not. She must. I don't see her now.
Yeah.
Larry,
This is a really good show, Peter.
Yeah. No, this has been great. Robin, you wanna wrap it up?
Yeah, thank you, everybody, for being here, and thank you to Dr. Bill Green for this wonderful discussion. And we're looking forward to the book, which I believe is going to come out fall. Is that correct? Is that the time?
God, I hope it's the summer.
Oh, the summer. Okay.
I hope.
Oh, you hope. Okay. When I talked to Heather, the press person, she wasn't exactly sure yet. So, but check it out, and we'll certainly have Bill back again on his future publications, and join us for upcoming history reveals, as well as the programs at the Eastside Freedom Library. And again, thank you all for being here. We'll have the recording up on our YouTube channels, hopefully sometime next week. So Peter, any last words, or Bill, any last words?
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Bill, for creating the work that gave us a chance to have the conversation. I do want to mention, actually, that history in the making goes on around us, and that we're in. And Friday night this week, we will be hosting a group of Starbucks workers they will be coming to the Eastside Freedom Library and talking about how they're trying to unionize Starbucks. And that'll be at 6:30 Friday evening, and you can watch it on Zoom. We're going to have a very small group of people physically present, but we'll be learning about the history that's being made right here in the Twin Cities. There were workers at 3 Starbucks stores who went on strike yesterday, still trying to get that first contract. And my colleague Clarence has put in the chat a link to how you can get the Zoom link so that you can join us Friday evening and watch. We live in interesting times.
Yes, we do.
For sure.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. We hope to see you soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care.